Have you ever had a good idea that you pretty much had no reason to believe that it was going to be a good idea except for your faith in it? You couldn't explain why it might work or what about it seemed like it was good. You just felt pretty confident that following through with it was going to be something that would end up being valuable in the long run. That doesn't happen to me very often. Well, I take that back. It happens to me fairly often because that's sort of what stories are. Nobody asks to hear a new story. You're just sort of glad to hear it once you have. I have noticed. And some stories come from places where you can kind of trace them back to their reasons and their roots. But sometimes they don't quite come from someplace logical or reasonable. Not even like some authors will talk about dreams, and sometimes they're not even that sort of easy to trace. I wrote this story on an instinct like that. It came out in a rush in a couple of days, and I can't explain why I wanted to write this story, and I can't explain where it came from. I just felt like it was coming from a good place, and I'm really glad that I wrote it down because I really like how it turned out. I still can't quite tell you what it's about. I have still quite not on a kind of like a thematic level. I haven't quite figured out how to summarize this story in a sentence. So I'm just going to read it, and maybe by wider publication, other people can help me to figure out how to tell other people what it's about. Cassandra's suggesting I should say at the end, other people can help me to figure out how to describe it. Alright. Right. Title: Fuzzy Ways. From the short story collection Ragged Museum. Fuzzy Ways. Till took the torn-up rabbit out of his snare and added it to the shreds of pelts already in his bag. Whatever nasty creature that had been roaming the woods did a good job of ruining his livelihood. He couldn't sell these shredded pelts for much. It would be a lean week. He reset the snare, then he almost left, but paused. The tracks caught his eye. He looked close at them. Wolfish ones. Setting snares in wolf country risked attracting wolves. He'd been one of a large party who'd gone out last season with the witch doctor to spread the scent of a captive wolf to mark the village's territory. Since they'd caught a huge alpha, the scent kept wolves away. It was time to mark territory again, maybe. Something about this track. Till leaned closer. It had a strange shape. Two long toes, too far apart. This wolf had bandy legs. No size of normal alpha would do anything here. Might be. Frowning and pretending like the chill up his back came from the breeze, Till left the place. On the long hike back to the village, he tried not to think about the chapters in his father's trapping manual that explained what to do about werewolves. They were brief and talked more about relocation than trapping. The rain started before he got back to the village. He pulled up the hood of his oilskin coat and hummed along to the tapping raindrops on leaves. The village struggled for space among crowded green trees in the nook of a valley. The mountains looked down on it, the smoke from cooking fires usually wisping thin over the huts. It didn't have a name, not big enough a town. The tavern was called the Pheasant's Tail, and that's what most folk around called the village. Till passed the houses. People glanced at him. People didn't do much more than glance. He didn't live in the town and didn't have many friends there. He walked to Gogoro's smithy. Gogoro's wife did most of the trading hereabouts, and Till usually sold pelts to her. She'd been none too happy to see him lately. It had been a while since he'd brought her anything worth her money. It had been a while since he had found one of his snares with a whole rabbit or ferret or raccoon in it. They'd been rough shredded for a while now. It would be a bad winter if something didn't change. The crowd gathered in the empty space in front of the Pheasant's Tail. Someone was shouting something. Someone else, a woman, was crying with loud sobs. Till watched the crowd sideways, walking toward the front of Gogoro's smithy. He thought he knew what it was the crowd gathered for. Gogoro's wife, tall and gray-haired, smoked a long pipe and stood under the eaves of the smithy, watching the frenzied crowd. Till looked away from the crowd. He gestured to Gogoro's wife, half a wave, half a salute, barely committing to either. "Shira's son gone missing. Torn to pieces," Gogoro's wife said in a flat tone. She didn't have much space in her heart for other people's sons, not after losing hers. She did frown. "Something needs to change." Till grunted. He nodded, not to express any interest in the conversation, but because it was the done thing. He started taking shredded pelts out of his bag. Not today's catch, but the day before yesterday, already dried and ready to be moved on into their next lives as whatever folk used furs for. It was a sorry bundle. None of the pelts were whole. "I can't hardly buy any of these," Gogoro's wife said through her frown, prodding with her pipe at the shredded pelts. "Couldn't hardly sell them for gloves. Couldn't hardly sell them for trim, even." An outburst from the crowd in the front of the tavern interrupted anything Till might have said. He glanced over. He saw old Shira, her face streaked in angry tears, and she shouted angry words at the crowd. Some of them she beat her fists on. She appealed to them to do something about her son. His body under a stretch of canvas near the middle of the crowd, next to the stone pillar that had stood in the middle of the town since before the town. Till turned back to Gogoro's wife. She still looked at Shira, a hard expression made straight lines of her face. Something about the sight of the bereaved mother acted on Gogoro's wife. Without saying anything else, she thrust a few coins at Till. They weren't enough, but Gogoro's wife had the look of a woman who wouldn't suffer argument. Till took the coins. He jangled them into his bag and left, going toward the tavern. He passed the crowd gathered around Shira. She cried out through her gasps for someone to hunt down the beast that killed her son. Closing his ears to it, Till ducked into the dim tavern. It smelled of outdoors in there, of damp and dust, just a little warmer. He spent one of his coins on a large mug of ale at the back of the room, close to the bonfire and the pit on the floor. He nursed the ale for a long time. He listened to gossip and stories about the countryside till long after night fell. It turned from a tense afternoon to a subdued nighttime. His ale long gone, Till stared at the fire, feeling far too sober and feeling no urgency to go back into the rain and trudge through the mud to his hut west of the village. Most folk had gone home. Those that were left rarely spoke, not till the door opened and the strangers entered. They drew the eye in their well-fitted clothes of fine linen, dyed dark blue. They were both thin, and they moved in ways that made Till think of praying mantises. They walked straight to Grunwald, the owner of the tavern, and they didn't look around themselves while they did. They didn't look around to see the shape of the room, nor even the people in it. Even though they entered a new place, they didn't look around for ambush. Somehow, that didn't make them seem vulnerable to Till. Till thought they'd be as difficult to sneak up on, listening as much as looking, maybe more. Like panthers. They had something pantherish about them. They reached the bar. The first and taller of the figures leant forward to talk to Grunwald. The second figure turned to look at the room. She was a woman, the other a man, although the layers of linen made that a hard thing to judge. She stood in an awkward fashion, like she didn't know quite what to do with her arms, like an adolescent, not grown into her body. She was taller than Till, though. "Well, that would be right here," Grunwald said, responding to whatever low-spoken thing the tall newcomer had said. "Cobb! Oi! You boneless lazabout, raise yourself!" Grunwald shouted at the round-headed boy who worked for him. Grunwald shouted instructions to Cobb. Summon the village, he told Cobb. It was a small village, and Grunwald, as the richest and most worldly person, he travelled all the way to Stone's Tree, which was a town with a name, was about as close to a leading figure in the community as the village needed. Any big decisions that involved the whole village got made by virtue of argument in the common room of the Pheasant. Grunwald moderated the arguments, with his stoic nods and shakes of his head. By the sour looks on the pale faces of the tall strangers, Till guessed they would have preferred a quiet conversation to what happened next. What happened next was the villagers reckoned most wise gathered around the fire pit in the common room of the Pheasant to talk and to listen to the newcomers. Gogro was there, a bench creaking under him, and his shrewd wife. Clemens, the richest potato farmer in the near area, cleaned out his pipe, watched the fire. Several of his older children sat with him, watching the strangers. And the mason stood nearby. He was called Balking, and he didn't come from the village, but lived here now, and had steady enough a head on his shoulders to be considered valuable. Till lingered nearby. His father had always been expected at these meetings. His father had a better idea of the country round about than anyone else. Since his father had died, the village hadn't quite decided what to do with Till. Too young to be trusted, and never worked to be liked. But he was still the best tracker and woodsman for miles. Till hung about, usually, because he didn't have anything else to do. This time, he felt interested. Clemens assumed his usual role in these sorts of meetings, as him who speaks first. His role as that had more to do with being straightforward than being witty. "Well, Corbier says you're proposing to hunt our vermin," Clemens said. His big hands cleaned his pipe. His bright eyes stared at the tall, slim newcomers. They stood near the fire, and its flickering light somehow failed to glow on them. The newcomers stood like shadows, not like things that cast shadows. "Yes," the taller of the newcomers said. He had a voice like winter wind in a cold cave. Till shivered. "We are hunters. We specialize in unsavory things." "Well," Clemens said. He finished cleaning his pipe. Putting its stem in his mouth, he blew the last crumbs of dust out. "Well," he said again, "if that be so, you come at a comely time, sir. And," he hesitated, glancing at the slightly shorter of the two, "lady," he said, "though I suppose you would not call yourselves servants of the simple people," Clemens went on, stuffing tobacco in the bowl of his pipe, and never taking his bright eyes off the newcomers, nor letting his frown flicker. Few could frown like crag-faced Clemens, with the firelight flicking on him, and his lines all the deeper from getting waked sooner than usual in the middle of the night. Usually folk in the town would wake in the middle of the night and wander around, partake in society, and then go back to bed. It was not even midnight yet. Clemens wasn't used to being awake this early. "We will," the tall stranger said in a hesitating tone, "hope for compensation." "And were them whose monster you were to hunt to prove skint?" Clemens said, half asking. He began puffing on his pipe. The newcomer paused before saying his answer. I think that the body of the boy awaiting burial should answer you better than I can. Clemens didn't respond. Instead, he smoked his pipe in slow breaths. He looked around at the gathered elders of the town. By the silent communication possible between people who've known each other most of their lives, he took census from them. Of course, every one of them would bring forth any amount of money, any reasonable amount of money, to anyone who could go hunt down the beast. Still, it was a well-known fact in these parts that Shira's husband had been the town's most skilled hunter. Her son's death had come hard on the heels of her husband's death. Both men and boys had died at the claws of a beast that had been both been sure they could kill. The villagers had been sure Shira's husband could protect them. They had a great deal of caution about the thought of these strangers accomplishing something that their friend had failed to do. What's your name, lad? Clemens asked. Kinsey, the newcomer said. Well, Mr. Kinsey, Clemens started. Kinsey interrupted. Just Kinsey, he said. Clemens made it clear by his glare that he did not appreciate the interruption. Mr. Kinsey, Clemens repeated, emphasizing the Mr. It would please us no sight to reward you for ridding our village of this wild monster. I'm sure we can agree on a fair amount. Kinsey nodded. Something in his posture made Till think that Kinsey had something to say. Clemens either didn't notice or didn't care. As soon as we've a good piece of evidence the beast is dead, you'll find yourselves a richer couple of young people. Clemens said it half flippantly, and more than half with the shrewdness of an old farmer who knew the danger of trusting strangers. It seemed to Till's eyes to particularly disturb Kinsey and the other newcomer. Most of the focus in the room was on Kinsey, and he had a better poker face than the woman. Till had his eyes on her, though. She looked near panic about it. Her dark eyes shifted everywhere. Till scratched his cheek. He told himself he wasn't curious, but he really was. Kinsey, a better wielder of dishonesty, smiled. Smiles didn't suit his slim, dry-skinned face. He looked about ready to fall over in exhaustion, yet strong as bones at the same time. A werewolf's skins you want, Kinsey said, and the skin of a werewolf will be yours. With that he made an attempt for a magnanimous bow. Though graceful, though nearly appearing sincere, it didn't suit him any more than the smile. It looked like it pained him, as if it grated against the edges of his dignity. Saying nothing further, Kinsey and the other left the pheasant. The villagers talked for long hours after that, though only somewhat of Kinsey and his tall, slim, dark-haired female companion. Till left the pheasant and went into the drizzling rain after the strangers. Fortunately, the rain had persisted, though thin as mist. Had it not, the strangers he pursued would have smelled him, though he wasn't to know that till later. When they thought they had gone far enough to be not to be overheard, the woman started talking. Till listened with ears practiced in listening for foxes among ferns. Gods of old, I thirst, she said, or that's what Till thought he heard. How do you bear it? I bear it, Kinsey snapped, as if nothing else could be said about it. The harsh tone suited his sharp voice. Do not speak of it. Even the air, the salt in that room. Do not speak of it, Twyla. Kinsey's voice sharpened. It drove the point home. Twyla left off the subject, but not without a frustrated growl. We move on tonight, then, she said, as if the answer to the question must be yes. Kinsey did not respond at first, and he kept silent in a way that cast doubt on the point. Tonight, yes, she insisted. We cannot afford... Kinsey started. Twyla interrupted with a growl. Her growls were strangely animal for a woman who in other ways seemed entirely, if not refined, then at least well honed, civilized, but not at the same time gentle. "I cannot bear to stand among their warmth, Kinsey," Twyla said. "I am hungry, and—" This time Kinsey interrupted. "And you will bear it," he said. His sharp tone softened just a touch. Twyla relaxed from it. "We must complete this. We must be paid. Bear it, Twyla. Bear it now. Get paid, or we face real starvation." Twyla, in her turn, said nothing. Her silence had a ponderous tone. "Yes, Twyla," Kinsey insisted. Twyla must have nodded in the gloom. At this distance, Till could not be sure. "Thank you, Twyla. We will persevere. The nights will get better." Twyla must have nodded again. They said nothing else for the few minutes it took them to leave the village. They went up the road, now a flood of sucking mud, and turned off it to go under the cover of the trees. They walked another few minutes. Soon they reached a cart. 2 horses stood under a tree, tethered there and looking unhappily in the rain. They had canvas blankets pulled over them, which helped some. The cart was tall and enclosed on all sides by wooden panels and over the top with a thick oilskin. A rustling and scratching came from it. Till heard breathing from something large and frustrated. "It's woken up," Twyla said. "She," Kinsey corrected. He took a chunk of raw meat from a crate near the cart. He went to the back of the cart and opened it. There was the clank of chains and a shake of movement that gave an impression of drunkenness. Till's heart rattled at what he thought he saw in the back of the cart. He saw a glint of eyes and a depth of dark fur. Then a pair of long-clawed paws snatched at the hunk of meat from Kinsey. The paws had more the shape of hands than paws, and they had fur covering them. A sound of snuffing and chewing came from the shadows, a sound very much like a dog, or perhaps a wolf, eating its first meal in a long time. In the juddering moment, Till muttered something, a profanity or some such. He hadn't the mental leisure to notice what it was, because he immediately tried to suck the sound back in. He had been trying to be stealthy, after all. He didn't have long to wonder what Kinsey and Twyla would do if they discovered him. Almost before he could decide to turn and run, a thin arm wrapped around his neck from behind. Thin, but strong as nightmares. A cold knife's blade pressed against his cheek. "One of us is about to have a much pleasanter night," Twyla's voice whispered in Till's ear. Her breath smelled and felt like the puff of wind from a gravestone falling on damp earth. Till remembered how that felt when they'd buried his father. Till tried to stay on his feet. Much slower than Twyla, Kinsey walked toward him. In the dark night, he looked like a shimmer of wind against the rain. His dark clothes shimmered, shiny and sloughing water. Everything except his pale face, that stood out in the dark, bright like a sliver of moon with black caverns for eyes. Kinsey looked more regretful than angry. "Hold on," Till said. "I can save your skin." It might have been the sheer oddness of the statement. Whether or no, it got Kinsey to hesitate and Twyla to slacken her hand. She didn't mean to harm Till. Not yet. Not entirely sure of himself what he meant to say, but happy to press the point for as long as it kept him alive, Till let his mouth run with the idea. What he said somewhat surprised him. "Well, catch one rather, not save one. I'm trapper in these parts, learned the trade from me da, from his back for hundreds of years." That might have been a lie. His Till's father never mentioned where he learned to be a trapper. "What you need's the skin of a wolf for a bear or a mountain lion. If what it is you want is to prove you've caught the beast's been preying on the folk in these parts, it's no business of mine with what you've got in your cart over yonder. You don't hear me ask about it. Although I see you've trapped it. Professional curiosity. Did you use a lure? A pit? I mean... He trailed off this line. Kinsey's thin lips started curling in a frown, and Twyla's knife pressed a mite harder. Neither of them had the patience for it. I mean, your business is yourn, and I shan't hinder it. What you need's a wolf's pelt, and I'd reckon you need it swift as dawn, eh? Who isn't in a hurry in these modern times? I never met a man who wasn't hurrying someplace. Why, only yesterday. You can catch us a wolf, Kinsey said, interrupting with a great deal of patience. Till appreciated it. Aye, certain as crows'll come, Till said, and he thought, oh, can I? That'll be worth seeing. But smiling, Till said, I've got the knowing of it. He glanced at the cart. It was still open, and the werewolf inside still snorted on its food. You've got the knowing of catching things too, Till said. His survival instinct wasn't his best feature. Why wouldn't you do it yourselves? Catch a wolf in that, I mean. We have a way with animals like this, Kinsey said, calm as parlor talk. Kinsey turned and walked back toward the cart, looking at it and the dark doors with the werewolf past them, like a piece of art he didn't fancy. We haven't luck with other animals, he said. Then he reached out a slow hand to the nose of the nearer of the two horses. He reached out like he hoped it would be different than the last time, but knew it wouldn't be. The horse took a step away from Kinsey. Kinsey, sighing, let his hand fall to his side. Clasping one hand behind his back, he looked back at Till and Twyla. Let him go, Twyla, Kinsey said. Twyla did. She shoved him, but Till would have borne a good deal to be free of her grip. He felt sure he would have been incapable of getting free of it by any means except her will, just to emphasize his gratitude, and when he recovered from stumbling, he turned to her and gave a large bow. Genteel, she said, through sneer-curled lips. My mum, Till said, she had courtly manners before I lost her. Now, he said, interrupting himself, and turning back to Kinsey, first, we'll be needing a rope. And this is a place no good for wolves. We'll need to go a little further up the mountain. Oh, and perhaps we'll need a rabbit or two. He said it all with confidence, and what he thought was, oh, is that what we'll need? Well done us. It is good to learn we have this hitherto hidden expertise. Trapping wolves, that's a new promise. Still, couldn't be too difficult for raccoons. Till smiled. Should hardly warrant any strong work. Then in a fit of daring, Till said, oh, and I shall be expecting some portion of whatever you get paid. Twyla snorted. Your life is not payment enough, she said. The prospect of continuing to live is a powerful motivator, to be sure, Till said. And the prospect of doing so a bit richer is too. And I've a reckoning that you prefer surviving Till Riggins keeping what he saw in the cart to himself. Surviving fails to be enough, Twyla stated, as if she thought it would be funny. Something in the unflinching look on Kinsey's face melted her smile. She cleared her throat, dropping her gaze, and shifted her weight on her feet. She muttered something too quiet even for Till to hear, though it sounded to him like, I thought it was funny. Not confident it showed the wisest side of his personality, Till turned his back on Twyla. He looked at Kinsey. The hair on the back of his neck felt like it sizzled from Twyla's eyes, and he kept flinching from what were probably bruises or brushes of wind, although his back felt like they must be the press of a knife. Till tried to ignore it. He managed to smile for Kinsey, though it surprised him. Kinsey's thin lips slid down in a frown, and Till couldn't help but watch his long fingers caressing the handles of knives on his belt. Till's throat grew dry from the nervousness of the moment. He tried not to swallow or signal in any way except to keep smiling. He was glad they couldn't read minds. His mind thudded with only a few words over and over again. About to die, about to die, about to die. Still unsure how it happened, but determined not to question it, Till set the snare for a wolf. He tried to keep his fingers from trembling. He almost had the sapling sprung the right way. His fingers slipped. The snare snapped too. He cursed. You might, he started saying, that Twyla and Kinsey might lend a hand. He glanced at them. They stared at him from the dark of their alcove. Might stay where you are and leave this to the expert. Till finished, making a stab at a confident tone. He wasn't sure he managed it, but he had other things to do. He started working at the snare again. This grows to be a lengthy process, Trapper, Kinsey said. Well, the market's hard for wolf pelts, Till said, letting his mouth answer without help from his brain. His brain had to concentrate on making a snare different than any snare he'd ever made before. It's been long now since I've made this sort of snare. The snare neared taking. Please take, he prayed to it. I've been more in the realm of badgers these few seasons, he heard himself say. Really, aiming for the stars, are we? He thought to himself. Badgers would be a trial. He felt the familiar feeling under his fingers, the satisfying, just hardly contained sensation of well-sprung snare. With care, holding his breath, Till drew his hands away. It held. He took 2 steps away, then sighed. His father would be proud. Well, proud of the snare. He'd cuffed Till around the ears till his head rattled for the mess his mouth had got himself into. Always said his talk would be his end. Till cast a last eye over the snare. The sprung tree looked a little strange, but a wolf wouldn't perceive much there. The half a rabbit of bait lay on the bed of pine needles Till had spread to mask his own smell The loop of rope lay on the ground, wide enough but not too wide. It probably wouldn't work. Well, who was Till to say that? He'd never tried to set a snare for a wolf before. It might work. Taking light steps for the first few steps, Till went to the hollow with Kinsey and Twyla. They had been odd about this location. They had insisted on starting right away in the middle of the night. Till led them into an area he knew a wolf pack patrolled. The first few spots Till proposed to set the snare, Kinsey rejected without saying why. Then Till found the spot with the nearby hollow. Kinsey finally agreed. Then, while Till set up the snare, Kinsey and Twyla spent a while looking at the hollow and the space around it. They kept looking into the sky, whispering. Till caught the words zenith and dusk. Then they went into the hollow and stayed there. Now Till joined them. It was a deep hollow made by a huge overcropping of rock that had the earth hollowed out under it from centuries of erosion. In the cool dust at the back of it, Till's fingers came across the skeleton of little animals, but nothing fresh enough that he worried it might be the home of something that might take umbrage at their presence. Then they waited. Till knew how to wait. He was a trapper. He knew how to wait. That said, he had never been near 2 people who waited so thoroughly as these 2. He kept glancing over at them to see if they were in fact still there. If he listened close, and for a long time, he heard a breath or 2. They never moved. They didn't register in that subtle, nearly insensible way that people in the same room usually registered. They didn't have that little bit of fidgety warmth that people couldn't help having. They could almost have been stones. Till wanted to think of it as unnerving. Somehow that didn't feel the right word for it. "Twyla," Kinsey said suddenly at one point. Well, it felt sudden. It was the first noise from any of them in many hours. "Twyla, stop fidgeting." Startled, Till looked at Twyla and tried to figure out how she had been fidgeting. Twyla frowned. "How long will we have to wait, Trapper?" "Could be minutes," Till said. "Could be hours. Could be the rest of the day." I worried you'd say that," Twyla said. "And dawn breaks soon," Kinsey said. In Kinsey's voice, so suited to only sharpness, Till thought he heard the suggestion of worry. While trapping, Till had a great deal of time to think. He thought about a great many things. His mother had made sure of that. One thing he spent a great deal of his thoughts considering was whether he wanted to be a trapper. Usually he concluded that he did not want to be a trapper. He concluded that he liked setting snares. He liked the woods. He liked the plans and strategy and the gadgets. He liked everything about being a trapper. Something about the current terms. That's what he didn't like. Dawn came. The day crept past. Till dozed in that still half-awake way he did on campouts when he watched snares he had particular investment in. He ate a little jerky and drank water and never offered the others anything. They never asked. They sat quiet as standing water in the deepest part of the hollow. Till never wondered why they seemed nervous about sunlight, because they never behaved as if they were, at least not giving any signs he recognized at that point in his life. At one point, a condor tried to take away the bait in the snare. Till threw stones at it till it left. Nothing else happened that day. It grew bright outside the hollow. The shade grew cool in the way different than nighttime, the cool that comes from the dirt, not from the air. Shadows inched past. Hazy rain chilled the air afternoon. The sun inched west. The clouds above cracked enough to promise a bright sunset over the green and misty mountains, roaring with light. Till looked forward to the view of it, another gift from his mother, appreciating the beauty in the world, and another reason for his father to cuff him around the ears. Till began to wonder if he'd have any more bollocks to say if the wolves never came. Probably not. He hoped he'd have the grace to die without bawling and begging. The last spears of yellow sun struck the clear space around the wolf snare. Till's ears pricked. He sat up straighter. He heard the suggestion of sound that he'd grown accustomed to heeding, although he couldn't quite say how he heard it. The sound of a sound that might come soon. Often it was the breath of air or a touch of paranoia. Nothing more. It was folly to ignore it. For moments all stayed silent. Everything else listened too. Then Till heard a rustle. He held in his relieved sigh. Nothing was yet certain. After a few long rustling seconds, they did come. Several wolves padded out of the shadows of the woods. They snuffed their way to the rabbit meat bait. Till had already been holding his breath. He extra held his breath at this point. Theoretically, it should work. The principle of snares never changed, and he had set more snares in his life than he could ever remember. He had often needed to improvise materials if they ran out, or different types if he had special orders. Why, he had once snared 98 voles in 3 days for a traveling glover. That would have impressed his father, and another time when a savage chieftain from the Far East said he needed special feathers, Till had managed to catch a hawk. He had even caught a monkey once, although that had been an accident. and he had let it go. Still, they were notoriously among the most difficult to snatch of all creatures. He knew his snares. He knew how to make them. He knew from stories that people far away went so far as to catch bears in traps, although he suspected specially made equipment for that. He knew that his snare ought to work. So if he had not already been holding his breath, he would have held his breath again. A grey wolf sniffed at the rabbit meat on the bed of pine needles. It put its teeth in the meat. Then a blaze of movement cast dust and leaves and fur into the air. A yip of surprise or pain split the quiet moment. All the wolves scattered, surprised and wary. All except one. And then Till breathed. With a faint and self-satisfied smile, he turned to look at Kinsey and Twyla. What he saw surprised him. He had expected to see them at least cheered or eager to see that they had got what they wanted. Nothing of the kind. They both frowned and leaned forward, acting uncertain. "The snare will not hold," Kinsey said. "Look, the wolf will shake free." "That happens sometimes," Till said. "Fix it," Kinsey said, his voice quiet but carrying all the force of being used to obedience. "You can," Till said. "It's your wolf. All you need to do is go and end his struggling before he gets away." "We," Kinsey interjected, "cannot." He and Twyla stared at Till. Till saw in their faces the urgency of the starvation. They perched at the furthest edge of the shade under the rock overhang in an ache of discovery. Till felt certain that catching this wolf bore greater importance than he could know, and that Twyla and Kinsey could not go into the sun. Till looked back at the struggling wolf. He knew what needed to happen, and he knew that he would have to do it. He knew it would need to be him doing it simply because he knew Kinsey and Twyla would not. "There's a strangeness to this," Till said. He drew his hunting knife and ran toward the struggling wolf. Till leaned against one of the standing stones in the village center, watching the transaction between Kinsey and Clemens. Clemens and the other elders of the village loitered around the warm-lit front door of the Pheasant. They seemed to find it strange that Kinsey and Twyla were gathering them again so late at night. But through the attitude of mild bemusement, they couldn't hide their cheer. They passed around the still damp and carefully tattered wolf's hide, skinned in a way to hide all the obvious wolfish things about it. Till felt pleased at his skill. He sharpened his knife and allowed himself a crooked smile. Clemens and Gogoro's wife and the others expressed their gratitude. They paid well for the tatty wolf's hide. The elders of the village went back into the tavern, and Kinsey and Twyla turned down an invitation to drinks. The door to the tavern closed, taking the warm light and loud talk with it, and leaving the nighttime quiet and silvery starlit. Kinsey came toward Till, the clinking of moving coins coming with him. He weighed a small leather bag in his hand, then held it out to Till. Till took it and smiled, nodding. He expected something else to happen. It seemed that at least social norms would demand that something else ought to happen. If Kinsey and Twyla had been in charge, nothing else would have. As if Till were the person and Kinsey and Twyla were cats. They turned away from him. For a moment, Till couldn't get past his surprise. Something about Twyla especially reminded him of his mother's courtly manners. He expected something else to happen. "That's it, then," he said aloud. He said it halfway as a question. "Did you expect a story?" Twyla said, over her shoulder. "Perhaps an explanation?" Kinsey chuckled about that. You've entered a grand tale, trapper, Kinsey said. Were I you, I would feel blessed to carry only a small part in a larger story. There is comfort in smallness if the story is destined to end with grief. You shall receive not the least argument from Till Riggins, Till said, saluting. May your heroic lives take their strange turns, and may shall we be happily well played. And my way shall be happily well played, and that shall be an end of it. You've a rare wisdom, Kinsey said. Without another word, Kinsey and Twyla disappeared in the night shadows. Before they had, Till turned toward the deer path that led out of town to his own hovel. Already he planned the entry he'd make into his father's book of traps. He had a leather-bound book full of scratched notes. Till's father had often scratched in it evenings during Till's childhood. Every time he closed it, he had said that maybe someday Till would have a note to add. Till never had. He often consulted it, learning new snares and new tracking tips. His father had been skilled and thorough, though, and Till had never discovered something that his father had not already put into the book. Not until now. Now Till had set a snare for wolves. His father had never done that. Till felt pleased he could add that snare. As he thought about it, he thought of another snare he had helped to lay, something his father would never have considered. A snare for the elders of the village, for Clemens and the rest. The bait had been the wolf's hide, disguised as the mangled skin of a werewolf. The elders of the village had fallen for it, caught completely. A well of satisfaction bubbled in Till at the thought of it. His mother would have approved of that snare. A snare of courtesy. She might not have been glad he'd gulled the village, but she would have approved that he'd used his wit for something. It kept him warm on the trudge through the dark woods to his hovel. By the time he came in sight of it, of his squat home, Till had the new entry just about planned. For a moment he stood looking at his hovel, the place where his father had died and where his mother had refused to die. He jangled the bag of gold in his hand. He thought about the new chapter in his father's book of traps. Till's supplement to Ronan's book of traps. It occurred to him that, when he finished this chapter on wolves, he would never write anything else in this book. Every day would be the same for the rest of his life. Trapping small game for their tatty skins and selling them to Gogoro's wife for pennies, then drinking it away at the pheasant's tail. Again and again, month in and month out. He weighed the gold in his hand. He thought about new chapters. He turned away from his hovel, wondering about two dark hunters and their live werewolf. He wondered where they'd gone, but calmly. A puzzle, not to stay his progress. A puzzle, not a stay to his progress. If it walked on the earth, he could track it. Time would betray anything to his patience. And scene. Oh. The first time I showed that story to anybody, though, they didn't get what I was getting at, which is fine, because that's not the point of a story. A story is something to be got to and then got to the end of and then thought about afterwards, and that's cool with me. I like to write about monsters and use them in the wrong ways. I've kind of talked about that before, and that's another story where I've done that. It's about werewolves, and I've used them sort of wrong-ishly. Have you ever seen the French film The Brotherhood of the Wolf? It's one of the cooler werewolf movies out there, and there's no werewolf in it, which I think is kind of a cool sort of like way of doing a monster movie. Promise and execute on, completely deliver on everything that you are trying to do with a monster, but then don't even have the monster in it the right way, because rightness is the plague of doing something good. That's my view. Bone Dragon. Hi, Shay. Hi, Caleb. Yeah. So that comes from Ragged Museum. That story does take place in my overarching fantasy universe, but in an obscure location, so it doesn't necessarily overlap with much else that happens. It comes from this short story collection, Ragged Museum. Untidy Stories is available all over the place. You can look it up. Next time I'm going to read a story called Corn Maze. And Corn Maze takes place in the other fantasy universe that I tend to write about that is it overlaps with the novel that I have out, City Song. Features similar characters. That one wears me out for some reason. Not entirely certain why. So I'm kind of glad to be through it, but I'm glad to have read it. I enjoy that story, so there you go. Thank you very much for spending time with me. I hope to see you again soon.